Hi, and welcome to the Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. This is the intro part where I talk about whatever the hell I want for a little bit before I get into my interview and book reviews with Justin Clark. But okay, so first I want to say this is a great interview. In the first half, I talked to my friend Jay, who also goes by the YouTube handle Fallingrateofprophet. We discuss what qualifies various ideologies as being on the left or not. And I think he makes a good case about for how defending certain authoritarian states doesn't qualify as being on the left. I'm sure there are very good arguments against what he's saying, but I think I largely agree with what his ideas here are. And yeah, I mean, we talk about this. We talk about China. We talk about Soviet Russia. We talk about a variety of concepts and ideas. It's actually a really, really, I think, intellectually stimulating conversation. I think, and I'm not sure about, I can't remember exactly because I just did the editing a little while ago, but I think that I kind of contradicted myself in that when discussing China, I talk about it one way during the interview with Jay, and then I talk about it another way in discussing the book review with Justin Clark. We're talking about the book Inventing Reality by Michael Parenti. And I think I contradict myself. I think my mind has changed on some of the things about China and the framing of their human rights abuses against the Uyghur population. The use of the term genocide has a connotation to it and is being used intentionally to frame things in a certain way. I am not going to defend China. I don't think they're a communist country. I don't think they fit the left idea of what our goals are. But also, I think that we need to be careful about the way we frame things. And the media, of course, has a certain idea about how they want to frame things. And obviously, when political parties in Canada and the United States are on side with calling something a genocide, well, you know something's up because they actively try to avoid the word genocide when it comes to the treatment of Indigenous peoples, where we actually tried to wipe them off the face of the planet. And by we, I mean the settler state of Canada and the settler state of the United States, the colonizers. Obviously, yeah, it's a complicated subject, one that we don't get into super deep on this, but I think that I just wanted to acknowledge that I think I contradicted myself in the second half because I gathered some new information and kind of changed the way that I think about it. Rather than just being on board with calling it a genocide, I want to have a more nuanced discussion about that. And rather than toe the American or the government line, the Western government line, I think it's important to really, double check where we're getting our sources and really discuss this in a real way with where the evidence is and where the real facts are. Okay, so beyond that, I don't have a lot to discuss in this intro. I think we're going to see a lot of, I think right now we're seeing a lot of false framing in the media, similar to the China situation, but slightly differently, is Palestine and Israel. As though, in the media, they try to paint it as two sides to an equal power struggle. And there's just not the same willingness on both sides to slaughter innocent people. And I think at this point, anyone applying critical thinking to the situation can certainly recognize that this isn't the same from the Palestinians as it is from the state of Israel. I think it's super, super, super important to recognize that if you criticize Israel, you will be called an anti-Semite by conservatives and possibly even liberals because it fits into their narrative that Israel and Jewish people are one and the same, and it's simply not the case. You can criticize a state and not be prejudicial or racist or whatever, anti-Semitic. You can criticize a state without hurting the people. In fact, I would argue that when you criticize the state, when you criticize the power structures, you are, in fact, helping the citizens. There's been some discussion about the use of the term apartheid. I just wanted to go into this just briefly for a second. The term apartheid is actually from the situation in South Africa, and it is from the Afrikaans language. And it just means that the state is holding a type of segregation, where one segment of the population one segment of the population maintains power, and anyone who doesn't fit that doesn't get any power or doesn't have power within the country or the society. In South African, it was in regards to non-whites and specifically black Africans, and it was meant to keep power, land, and resources out of the hands of anyone who wasn't white. It was, just quickly reading on it, I didn't realize that there was an Asian element to the segregation, but apparently this type of apartheid segregation was used on Asian folks as well as black folks, so or black Africans. So similarly, in the case of Israel and Palestine, you have a state with a lot of arms using the threat of violence as well as other methods of withholding resources in order to gain land and maintain power in the hands of the Jewish population. Like, not the Jewish people, not that it needs to be in quotes, but it is considered an ethno-state for Jewish folks or the Semitic people. If recognizing that sounds like anti-Semitism to you, then you're equating the practices of the state with the existence and actions of the citizens, and that's not accurate or fair. If you make the claim about Jewish power controlling things in America or Canada or any other state than Israel, then you would be spreading an anti-Semitic conspiracy. That is like the conspiracy of the Rothschilds or the protocols of the Elders of Zion and shit like that. But when we're talking about a literal ethno-state, a literal Jewish ethno-state, trying to assert its power over a population within shared borders, then you are talking about colonialism, and the way that it's maintained is through apartheid and war crimes. A lot of conservatives, for some reason, have attached themselves to Israel and the power that it holds. So they like to draw that false equivalence. And like I said, liberals too. They also, like conservatives do this more than liberals do, but they like to equate the actions of Hamas with the actions of Palestinian citizens. And it's a little funny that a group which claims to be all about individual responsibility and is as anti-collectivist as one can be, ends up equating citizens with the state in such a way so that they can paint a group in one way and another group in another way. They also do it in terms of American patriotism and Canadian exceptionalism all the time too. Like they like to say, if you are not part of America, if you don't support the state, then you're not part of America. You're not an American. Or Canadians are this way or Canadians are that way. And it's always like some cultural bullshit or some state propagandized media tool, like they narrative is what I'm trying to get across. Anyway, my point is that a free Palestine would be one that doesn't have colonizers taking land, housing, and resources from the indigenous population. I notice I use the word indigenous, and if you are from Canada or the United States, that might remind you of the indigenous tribes in Canada that have had land taken by colonizers and then were shuffled off into small barren sections of land with their resources stolen, and they were expected to survive under a foreign and intolerant society. And I think we might need a wake-up call regarding our treatment of indigenous peoples, because we've been truly awful and genocidal towards them, and a lot of folks still dismiss that within the context of Canada, and it needs to be addressed. It needs to be recognized. Personally, I see a lot of parallels between various settler colonial states. Empire is kind of does the same thing everywhere it goes, no matter who the empire is. So this apartheid style segregation and theft of land and resources is just part and parcel of colonialism. It's part of imperialism. It's important, I think, that we focus on helping the people. We have to really do the whole helping people and not the state thing. This drives me into frustration a lot because there's like this in the way that people narratively don't want to be guilty of the crimes of the state that they belong to, but also want everybody to follow the rules of the state or be part of a cultural identity or a state endorsed identity. It's absolute. I don't know. I find it absurd and frustrating. Okay. But you've listened to me ramble on for way too long already. So I hope you enjoyed this interview, but remember that this is only part of the chat that I had with Fallingrateofprophet. If you want the entire thing, then all you have to do is become a patron at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can just email me with the subject line, Falling Rate of Profit, and just let me know that you want the full interview, and I will send you either the audio file or the link to the unlisted video. So with that, stay tuned after the first half, because the book review section of this episode is also great, and it's a lot of fun, and it's really, I think, a really well done book review, and it's about a very important book. So we've got the first half. I talk to Falling Rate of Profit about what's happening, what is the left, who fits into the left, what do we count as the left, how is it defined, and then in the second half we talk about media narratives with Justin Clark on his book review in the Red Reviews. Hi and welcome to The Mind of Skeptical Leftist, the show where I talk to a variety of people to promote and spread progressivism, left-wing politics, and critical thinking. Today I'm talking to Jay, aka Falling Rate of Profit. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So the reason that we got to do this is because there was a discussion online about somebody was defending North Korea in a comments thread that on a post I made.
Yes. And
various people had obviously a variety of opinions, but one of the opinions was that people who defend an autocracy like North Korea aren't leftists.
Yeah, I think that's true, depending on the grounds that you're defending them on. So, for example, if a war broke out between the United States and North Korea, or between China and North Korea, or whatever, if a military conflict broke out and you defend a place on purely anti-imperialist grounds, you maybe say this is in violation of international law, we disagree with this war happening, and so on. That's one basis for defense. And I think it would make sense on the left to defend the people who live in that place, regardless of what system they live under, if they're being subjected to imperialist war. That does not mean that you defend the system that they live under. And I think I think we've seen examples of that, where so for example, the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. It makes sense to call for, defending the Cuban people from that kind of invasion. Well, it doesn't mean that, you're necessarily approving of, Castro's dictatorship or something.
Right.
So, yeah, I think on that ground, it makes some sense. But the neo-Stalinists that we see around in a lot of these online discussions tend to conflate the two, and it's really frustrating to encounter, because they accuse you of defending the imperialist powers that might want to attack them if you so much as even question the systems that are in place there. Now, originally, I believe you used the word autocracy to describe North Korea? Is that?
Yeah.
I got a laugh out of I forget who it was now who described it as a necrocracy. Because Kim Il Sung is the eternal president, and he's long dead. So I forget who said that, but it made me laugh a little because there seems to be some truth in it. They had this bizarre cult of personality that I think has probably been taken to greater extremes than virtually anywhere in the world. It's hard. I think Stalin would blush at some of the excesses of the North Korean propaganda machine. So it's pretty bizarre. Silly. It is.
But one of the alternative views is that even though they have terrible ideas about who to fit, and they're making this error conflating the people with the system and whatnot, that those people, those tankies or what have you, are still leftists. So I wonder, why do you think they don't count as leftists?
Well, I think it really comes down to what goals you have. We have to ask, what are left goals, and do these people actually care about them in any way? Because I don't see much of any evidence of that. So, for example, a lot of the political discussion that we have about ideology in the last decade or so, I see it, a lot of it has been really framed by this political compass type of analysis where we talk about authoritarian left, libertarian left, authoritarian right, libertarian right. And I'm not saying that there's no basis for that. But what I am saying is that if you actually look at the goals that so many of these regimes and their supporters consistently espouse, I don't see how they fit into the authoritarian left part of it, because where's the left? I don't see it. Where when we look at those goals, okay, so for example, we don't just talk about things like, reducing economic inequality and things like that, because those goals can be anywhere. There was a sort of right-wing thinking that's kind of dead, but it's kind of dead. But there was this whole idea of noblesse oblige, you have a noble obligation to help the poor. That idea on the right is essentially dead. They wanted to preserve the existing inequalities, but you had some obligation to help the poor through charity, through whatever.
Right.
And that, it's still very right wing. Okay. And if you look at the sorts of systems that are in place in these kind of countries, I think it actually bears a little more resemblance to that than it does to the left. So you have to ask how it plays out. In terms of internationalism, for example, they reject it. They come down firmly on the side of ultranationalism. I mean, is North Korea internationalist?
No.
Not in any way. Was Stalinism internationalist? No. We can say Marxism was certainly internationalist. We can certainly say that. We can say in a lot of ways Leninism still was, whatever flaws it may have had. It was still committed to the idea of international revolution. Right. It was committed to the idea that the at least in theory, not always in practice, but at least in theory, that whatever vanguard existed, that vanguard was to be a tribune for the oppressed, and that the oppressed peoples that existed, whether it was racial oppression or sexual oppression or whatever, in theory at least, and not always in practice, the idea was that you're standing up for the people who are downtrodden.
Right.
I see tankies in internet threads, and I see some of the discussion about race. I see some of the discussion about LGBT issues, about gender, and a lot of it to me is indistinguishable from neo-Nazis. Like, I'm not exaggerating here.
Right.
Like, they're pushing far right ideas around these things where LGBT people are seen as degenerates and so on. Like, what is left about that? Seriously, what is left about that? I don't see it. You know? Yeah,
that's I haven't seen so much about like, I guess one could say that I've seen a lot of dismissive behaviors or attitudes around that stuff. Like, they don't necessarily feel one way or the other. They just think that all identity politics is bullshit, and that transgender people are bougie, or, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. You know, we have a long understanding of the way this has played out in our society, and a lot of people, you know, really start that history at Stonewall, and since then, you know, we consider that you know, the birth of the modern gay rights movement, which later became, you know, more inclusive, LGBTQ plus, and we have that understanding, but we don't seem to have the understanding that, you know, 100 years ago, I mean, the Bolsheviks legalized homosexuality. I mean, that was right. It was very. I'm not going to say that they were progressive by today's standards, but by their own standards of the time. You know, they threw out the old penal codes that existed under the Tsar, and they didn't really see the need to reinstate laws around things like that, which for its time was progressive. They sent representatives to international conferences on sexuality. A lot of the research that comes out of, you know, understanding those sorts of issues in the early part of the 20th century came out of Germany. Came out of Weimar, Germany. And, you know, a lot of people associate the Nazis with burning books, but we rarely ask what books they were burning. They were burning books on essentially human sexuality, including
right.
You know, that was the stuff that they were burning as degenerate. And I don't see from a lot of the neo tanky types much difference from that. I really don't. I don't see much difference from the book burning sort of attitudes. And I understand the identity politics thing, but are they really rejecting identity politics? I'm not sure if they are. I think they're just subscribing to an alternative version of it, you know?
I've often said, like, that, I mean, identity politics, depending on how you define it, exists in everything that is political, and everything is political.
It has to. It has to. You know, I think there's a sort of vulgar identity politics that exists.
Right.
Like an oversimplified identity politics. But that doesn't mean that the whole is necessarily bad. And I mean, you look back, you know, to those figures like Rosa Luxemburg and Clara Zetkin and the socialists and anarchists that were around at the time, Emma Goldman, you know, and they they talked about that in, I guess, in different terms, but they spoke of the, bourgeois feminism and that existed, and they differentiated between that and women's liberation through socialism and
Right,
whatnot.
right.
So, the idea that getting back to the main point, the idea that they're on the left, I have to ask, like, even economically, like, sometimes, regardless of the feelings on identity politics, regardless of the feeling on any of that sort of thing, I guess we have to ask, economically, are they on the left? There used to be the phenomenon. It existed around the world, but it was primarily the United States and Canada, of the one company town. And the one company towns that existed, where people would come and they would work, and the company would provide all the housing, provide the amenities for the workers, recreation. The workers would be paid in scrip that was essentially worthless elsewhere, but you could spend it at the company store.
Right.
And basically, they would advertise themselves as if, this is the ideal place for working people to live, and recruit people as not in a necessarily utopian way, but in a way that would, try to play up the most attractive features of coming to live in one of these towns.
Right.
And, if you put national borders and around one of these towns, okay, and you gave it a standing army, politically, what is different between that and North Korea, Stalinist Russia? Really? Yep. There's essentially very little difference. So I would argue that the USSR, once it really consolidated a full-on state capitalist economy, it was like a giant company town of a couple hundred million people, And, what is left about that? I think that the earlier you get, and the closer you get to the time of the revolution itself, there were certainly lots of features about it that were left. It was internationalist. They respected national self-determination. They, it was about breaking down barriers between workers in different places and so on. Now, but once it really became consolidated as like a, socialism in one country, as Stalin, as Stalinists like to put it, what's left about that? I don't see it. I don't see it in any issue. I don't see it in the identity politics issues. I don't see it in the economy. Really, how is it not just another company town?
Yeah. That's something that I think. Okay, and obviously I'm an anarchist, so I kind of do. Personally think that any situation where you start off with a state consolidating power or whatever, then you're going to have that same similar effect, where the power, the money, the wealth, the resources, they all funnel upwards to a select group of people. And I mean that regardless of what, other left-wing people might think, or that is what Russia was. That is what Stalinist Russia was. It was money and power and wealth funneled up to the elites, and anybody who spoke up got murdered.
Pretty much. And I mean, even earlier than that, if you look at even under the latter days of the dictatorship under Lenin, it had really started to go in that direction. And I mean, there were, I'm not going to say that there's no difference though, because, you can actually read Lenin, whether you agree with him or not. I think he's a fantastic read. People should check him out because
very quotable.
Very quotable, and as a theoretician of capitalism, who understood imperialism and so on, is first rate in that sense. As someone who understood the need for organization, I think there's still a lot to learn. But I would argue that he got the economy wrong. That's where I think it messed up. And I guess if I were to put myself on the political spectrum, I would say kind of left Marxist. I tend to come out of that. For a number of years, I was a member of a group that came out of the Trotskyist tradition.
Okay.
But I did leave over some political differences and whatnot. But I think that just looking at the idea, I guess, that comes from Marx, the idea that the economic base of a society has an overwhelming role in determining what the political superstructure of a society looks like. Right. Looking at that, you can have all of the progressive ideas you want about things like whether it's identity politics or internationalism or whatever, but eventually that economic base is going to constrain you and push you in certain directions if you adopt a system that has flaws that push you away from that. So regardless of whatever attitudes you may have in those issues, and let's face it, when we're talking about early Bolshevism, it wasn't a monolith. There was a diversity of opinion on things like that, on things like women's liberation and things like international. There was a diversity of opinion, but eventually, as economic necessity catches up with you and the only path forward that you see is consolidating state capitalism, you're going to start talking like state capitalist. I mean, you might use some of the rhetoric of, workers of the world unite or whatever, but you're certainly not, practicing it to much, if any degree. So if it's true that the economic base of a society, the mode of production, plays a huge role in determining what the political superstructure of a society looks like, then we would expect a state capitalist system to turn out a certain way. We would expect private capitalism to turn out a certain way. We would expect feudalism to turn out a certain way, So that, I think, is really the thing that we need to look at is the economics of it and ask whether these people got it right. I see a lot of the debate online, and this is where we may disagree. We may diverge on this, as you identify as an anarchist. I see a lot of the debate online coming down to the issue of libertarianism versus authoritarianism. Right. Whereas I see a lot of the divergence happening around issues of economic organization, whether it's state control or worker control,
Right. Right. Yeah.
So that's, I think we probably arrive at a very similar place. We probably do. But I think that we probably come at it from, a different angle. We mentioned, Rosa Luxemburg. I don't think, looking at her ideas, and her writings and what she advocated and whatnot, I don't think that she would necessarily fit the bill for what we would call libertarian left if we're going,
Okay, yeah.
if we're going in the direction that she was opposed to the state, because she wasn't. She wasn't.
Right.
I mean, yeah, she wanted the eventual abolition of course, but she wasn't, opposed to using the state. But it was a very different conception of the state than, say, what came in Russia. And you can read her writings about it. And basically, that's kind of where I come from in terms of my analysis of that whole thing. Is I look at what she wrote, and I try to do my own thinking on it as well. But I find that more often than not, I agree with her praise of what happened in the Russian Revolution, and I agree with her harsh criticisms,
right,
of what happened. Excuse me. So,
yeah, that's one of those things. Like talking to like somebody who identifies as a pro-state socialist. I often make the case that even though I'm an anarchist and we say that we are anti any state, right? That doesn't mean that we're anti governance as a concept, right? Like we still need to organize our society in a certain way, and that could be considered governance and I mean, it's hard to, it depends on what you mean by these things too, right?
Yeah, it does. It does. And historically, we've seen examples of that. I think of the Iroquois Confederacy, which I think that we could say was like a government without a state. It was, it was a series of communities that came together under political agreement. But there was no, overarching state structure holding it in place. In a way that I've heard some discussion about that may have acted as some kind of inspiration for the American Revolution. I don't really know about that, but I do know that there are other models that we can look at where there is governance, not necessarily a centralized state, but not necessarily abdication of the concept of authority either. Like the Zapatistas, for example,
right?
They're an example of that. I would say, they do hold a certain degree of authority. But it's not like a centralized state structure in the sense that we would identify with capitalism. Rojava is another one, where it's not a centralized state with a bureaucracy and so on, but it's not really a free for all either. If you know what I'm saying,
Right? Yeah, actually. Because of the way they have to stay in defense of themselves all the time, they have a pretty rigid social order, right? Mm-hmm. With like a military that is, careful and rigid. They have to be to some degree because they're defending themselves against the surrounding area. But yeah, they like you say, they don't have like per se a leader who rules over, like who leads the way a president rules, Yeah.
And the question that I keep coming back to, and I think there are a lot of bad faith arguments about this. So for example, I've seen so many online threads, with, the neo-Stalinist types, the tankies, where they quote, Engels' essay on authority. And I've seen a lot of bad faith arguments around this. But I also think that Engels had a point in that, revolution can be a very authoritarian thing if you look at the dynamics of, one class fighting another. Yeah, in that sense. But there are a lot of bad faith arguments around it as well, where it becomes used to justify any sort of state tyranny. So they'll use Engels' essay to justify, the the Great Leap Forward, or
Right.
you know what I'm saying? Like those are just terrible arguments.
Yeah,
but
right.
I do think there's a certain point, and the point that I keep coming back to, I don't consider myself an anarchist, but I certainly open to anarchist ideas. And the thing that I keep coming back to is just the question of monopoly of arms. That is, do you want to allow the other side to arm? And I would argue no.
Right.
And there is an argument. I'm not saying that it's the only way to look at it, but there is an argument that says that the state, the existence of the state, is essentially just enforcement of the monopoly of arms, enforcement of a monopoly of violence. And in that sense, I would want revolutionary forces to have that monopoly. But that doesn't mean that you want, centralized bureaucracy with, courts and all that stuff. You know what I'm saying, right? Like, I think it's too easy to jump from one to the other. And if we're talking about the neo-Stalinist types that we encounter online, the tankies, they make these sorts of arguments so often where whether you're an anarchist or whether you're just question the authority of these state capitalist regimes or whatever, that is seen as essentially, betraying the chances of a revolution. You're going to let private capitalism and imperialism walk all over you because you don't accept their authority over things. And that's just a really bad faith argument because, are they the only options? Is this? I
would argue no.
No, I would argue no as well. I would argue definitely not. And I think that question of anarchism, in a lot of ways, I think it comes down to the way I see it personally is if you say you aren't an anarchist, are you happy about that? Are you happy about it? And here's what I mean, okay? I don't necessarily consider myself an anarchist, but I would love to be proven wrong. I would absolutely love to be proven wrong about that, because if I'm proven wrong, that means that we don't need these institutions that have been associated historically and continue to have so many problems around organizing them, state structures and stuff. If it's hard to look at the world, whether today or historically, and argue that those sorts of structures have not had massive problems.
Right,
okay? Right. It's hard to. If you view them as an unfortunate necessity in a time of revolution, that's one thing. If you view them as desirable,
that's a whole other thing.
We got major issues because they're not desirable at absolute best. At absolute best, and this would probably be the divide between anarchism and classical Marxism, is that they're an unfortunate necessity, basically legacy software that you've you come to inherit, and then eventually you want to clear it off your system. But I don't see the neo-Stalinist types arguing in that way at all. I see them as seeing these types of structures as inherently desirable.
Right. Which I think gives the I don't want to say the lie to it, but it gives that's where the authoritarianism is, right? Like that's where that defense of Stalin comes from, or the North Korea. They want to have a state that dominates the citizens while espousing citizens' power, I guess, as a rhetoric.
Yeah, and that's all it is. It's rhetoric. And they want to regulate basically every every facet of people's lives. There's actually something I would like to read if I can find it on my phone here. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's something that I don't think that has necessarily been engaged with enough. And it's just, I mean, it's a couple paragraphs, really, that Marx wrote.
Okay.
Marx wrote in his day as a criticism of some of the other tendencies that were emerging around the workers' movements. And the one that he was very harshly critical of, he called Barracks Communism.
Okay.
And he says he says, what a beautiful model of barrack room communism. Here you have it all. Communal eating, communal sleeping, assessors in offices regulating education, production, consumption, in a word, all social activity, and to crown all, our committee, anonymous and unknown to anyone, as the supreme director. This is indeed the purest anti-authoritarianism. So, yeah. So, but I think that little snippet of Marx, and Marx is very quotable. If we want to talk about quotable historical figures, that little snippet has something that is really interesting because it even in his day, he called out this notion of people who wanted every facet of the working class's life to be harshly regulated.
Right.
And that's eventually what emerged, in these places. I would argue that it has much more in common with what he called barracks communism than anything that, he or Engels advocated, really. That would be my assertion. And I have to ask why. Like, what is attractive about this? I understand that when you live in a society that is messing things up as badly as ours is, I understand that there is an attraction to alternatives. Now, of course, you're gonna want to look around for alternatives, but are those alternatives? Are they any better at the at the things that
There's a bit of a saying like around, this makes me think of it around anarchist circles is even like Soviet cops are still cops.
Yeah.
Right. So the idea that we can have a freer society by rigidly structuring the daily lives of working people, it seems counterintuitive to me.
It is completely counterintuitive. It is completely counterintuitive. And again, I think if we're talking about just authoritarianism in the strictest sense, I would come down on the side of a revolution needs to enforce monopoly of arms. At least, until you've, dealt with counter-revolution. I would come down on that side. That doesn't mean that I would come down on the side of, the KGB, or
right.
the Cheka under Lenin, for that matter. They committed horrible atrocities. Okay.
Yeah.
There's no doubt. Or Soviet cops or whoever you want to say, but I think it is possible to differentiate between them. I'm sure that there's probably some, maybe yourself or maybe some anarchist listener out there is probably going, who is this authoritarian you're talking to? But I think that there is a real difference. And for me, again, I keep coming back to the economy. I keep coming back to the idea of the economy being determining factor here. Do you remember? It's about I think 2008, 2009, somewhere in there. I think it was 2009.
Okay.
There was this issue of Newsweek. There was this issue of Newsweek, and on the cover there was a red hand shaking a blue hand, and it said something like, "We are all socialists now." Do you recall this?
I do not remember that at all.
Okay. Well, what it was, basically, it was a cover story on Newsweek, and the idea was that because there was such heavy state intervention in the economy after the crash of 2008, that basically the old arguments about neoliberalism and hands-off economics no longer stood, and now everybody's a socialist because we're pushing for state intervention.
Because it's not laissez-faire capitalism.
That's right. Yeah, because there's bailouts and partial nationalizations and so on. And this sort of thinking has really penetrated our consciousness, whether it's under capitalism or whether we're talking about revolutionary alternatives or what. The idea that state intervention equals socialism. Whatever the state does, that's socialism.
Right.
And that's a real prejudice that we have to face up to. Yeah. And I don't agree with it. And it was pretty clear, again, if you read Marx and Engels, they didn't agree with it either. Especially later on. Like Engels, for example, I was just pulling up a couple quotes there while I was on my phone there. What Engels wrote was that when you have nationalization, that doesn't mean that it's socialism. And a lot of the arguments on the left coming from the defenders of North Korea or the defenders of China or the USSR or whatever, they're arguing it is socialism because it is the state, or at least at least impartial, that it's socialism. But no, there's a quote here. I just gotta oops. Okay, yeah. Here we go. This is Engels. Okay. The modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine, the state of the capitalists, the ideal personification of the total national capital. The more it proceeds to taking over of productive forces, the more does it actually become the national capitalist, the more citizens does it exploit. Yep. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. Yep. The capitalist relation is not done away with. That is that is so radically different. Just that quote is so radically different outlook than what I see coming from the left.
Right.
in these, because I mean that's how we got drawn into this discussion in the first place, was just reacting to these sorts of ridiculous online tanky types, with their gulag memes and their, oh my god, like,
although I gotta love a gulag meme though. They're funny as hell.
I just shake my head. I'm like, man, but yeah, no, really, it seems that they cannot, it seems to me that they're about as radical as Newsweek magazine, in that they cannot distinguish between state intervention and state ownership and socialism. Now, that quote that I just shared was Engels, and what's interesting though is that he doesn't argue against nationalization. He goes on later, but it's not nationalization in terms of control of the centralized control. He goes on to argue that it's under the control of the working class that we can overcome the problems that state capitalism creates. And that is very different than what happened in practice in revolution, because there was very little worker control and eventually none, you know?
Yeah.
So when you
all right. So where can people find your content online?
I have a YouTube channel. It's kind of moribund. I think I only posted 1 or 2 videos. I posted a rant about basic income, which I'm against. I think it's a neoliberal trap.
That is something we will have to discuss another day.
I would love to. But I have a video there about that, and I have another one. I can't remember if it's still up or if I pulled it down. But there's not much content. But it's on YouTube. The YouTube channel is Fallingrateofprophet, just like my handle on here.
Perfect.
And there's nothing fancy about the content. There's no production value whatsoever. It's literally me rambling into a camera. That's what it consists of. And
that's all right.
So I hope to eventually get around to doing more. I do hope that people will check out what is there on the YouTube, and hopefully enjoy and learn something from it.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me.
All right. Take care.
All right, folks. That's it for this part of the interview. If you want the full interview, make sure to go become a patron at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can just email me with Falling Rate of Profit in the subject line and let me know what you want, audio or video, and I will get that to you. So now on to Read Reviews with Justin Clark and his review of Michael Parenti's Inventing Reality. So welcome to number 3 of Read Reviews with my friend Justin Clark. So what do you got for us this week?
Well, thank you, Cory. I'm really looking forward to today's episode, because so far we've kind of talked about a book that I really liked. I've talked about a book I really didn't like. And now we're going to talk about a book that, in my opinion, is an indispensable classic. So today we're going to be talking about Inventing Reality, The Politics of Mass Media by Michael Parenti, which was originally published in 1986. And a second edition was published in 1993, which is the edition that I read. Okay. It's almost impossible to try to find a book, like a hard copy of this book. So I got an ebook version and I read that. And this book is a Marxist critique of the mainstream media, particularly in the United States, and the ways in which it sort of, in his phrase, invents reality. And so to give you some interesting context, so Michael Parenti, who is still alive, I think he's in his 90s, maybe 80s or 90s, is a political philosopher. He got his PhD, I think, at Yale, but he is a Marxist scholar, and sort of like, I guess the best parallel is like Noam Chomsky is for anarchism what Michael Parenti is for Marxism.
Okay.
And so I guess that's kind of what you could say, is that he is very much in that vein. He's a critic of U.S. empire. He's a critic of mass media culture. He's written, I think, a couple books on this. One we're going to be talking about, Inventing Reality. He wrote another one called Make Believe Media, which is, I think, his critique of like film and television, which I haven't read. But he's best known for his book, Black Shirts and Reds, which is a collection of essays that goes through and sort of dispels some common myths and misunderstandings about the rise of fascism, and then the decline of the Soviet Union, the decline of real existing communism in the world.
I think I might have heard people talking about that book before, on something that I was watching or listening to.
It's a classic as well, and I just finished reading that as well, so we can always do that in another Read Review at some point.
Sure.
But this is the first book I read of Michael Parenti's, largely because I find it very interesting that there are two books about a critique of the media, particularly the mass media in the United States, that come out relatively around the same time. So Michael Parenti's book comes out in 1986. And then the more popular book that kind of everybody knows is Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, which came out in 1988. The main difference, I think, between the two books is that while the latter was sort of has what Chomsky and Herman call like the propaganda model. So Parenti doesn't really do that. It's more of a broader statement about the ways in which political economy shapes media production. And so he spends an incredible amount of time sort of laying out, multiple themes about how multiple different concepts. So he first talks about like the ways in which media conglomerates function. So the way that they sort of corporate consolidation. He talks about the ways in which journalists and television producers often do what he basically calls self-censorship, which actually happens a lot more than you think.
For sure.
And a lot of it is related to economic interests. And then he also spends, I think, the sort of back half of the book talking about the ways in which the media sort of props up U.S. empire. And he has specific case studies where he talks about the ways in which the U.S. media basically will always find a way to malign left-wing movements around the globe. So he sort of spends some time talking about the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and the way in which the U.S. media sort of impugned that movement for socialism, and the way in which they sort of supported Reagan's propping up of the Contras, which were these right-wing militias or death squads that were sort of fighting against the Sandinista government. Reagan famously referred to them as like akin to the founding fathers. He spends a considerable amount of time talking about the invasion of Grenada, which happened in the early 1980s under Reagan as well, and how they were trying to set up this sort of eco-friendly socialist state within this island of Grenada. And how there was this sort of lame media story about hostages that wasn't really particularly true. But that was sort of like the sort of remember the main moment that sort of, the Lusitania movement that got people interested in sort of pushing for war. And then in the revised edition, he includes the first war in Iraq, the Gulf War, Desert Storm, and the way in which the U.S. media pretty much consolidated in support of the war effort, and that dissenting voices were often shut out, which is something we very much saw with the second invasion of Iraq in 2003. Yeah. One example, he doesn't have in the book, because the book is obviously was published in 1983, but a decade later with the second invasion of Iraq, one of the most popular and well-known television personalities throughout the late 80s and into the early 2000s was Phil Donahue. And Phil Donahue had an MSNBC show, I think it was an hour-long show or whatever, and his show was canceled because he was one of the few mainstream media voices on cable news to critique the motives of the Iraq War. And Parenti has numerous examples in the books of journalists who get silenced, or they get fired, or they get pushed to a crappy sort of desk within a newspaper because they're trying to actually actively do journalism.
Right.
And one of the main takeaways from his book is thinking about how the sort of traditional liberal critique of the media is like, well, it's flawed, but it could be better. Or it's like, well, they make mistakes. And it's like, his whole thing is like, they don't actually make mistakes. Like or if they do, they make, that's not really the point. Like the big things that people think of as being mistakes, whether it's like buying into the lie of weapons of mass destruction, or like buying into the lie that happened with the first Gulf War. Cause there's a very legendary story about how babies were thrown out of incubators in Iraq. During the first Gulf War, and that never happened. It just flat out never happened. And the young girl that they brought to testify into the U.S. Congress to say that this happened just so happened to be like the daughter of like some high up person within like the Saudi government or something like that. I mean, basically the firsthand testimony was spurious at best because it wasn't a reliable source. It was sort of propaganda, right? And so, I think ultimately the thing I find interesting is that, so the sort of Chomsky-Herman model is sort of manufacturing consent, right? built within the Chomsky-Herman model itself is still this idea that like they're manufacturing consent, and yes, they're telling lies, but they're also trying to like fix the system itself, or that ultimately it's a flawed mechanism based on corporate power.
But the truth is there, and that's kind of...
Yeah, but the truth is there. And Parenti kind of takes it a little bit farther and says, actually, I give you all that. That's absolutely true. But a lot of times what they do is they don't so much lie so much as they leave information out, which is sort of like lying by omission.
Right. Yeah.
Or like sort of lying by commission, where they'll sort of put like a fact in between two sort of falsehoods or stretches of the truth.
Okay.
And it's all in service of the U.S. empire, essentially. So when he says what liberals do is they often go, well, it could be bad, but it can be reformed, or it can be better. It doesn't work. It's kind of not functioning. To a leftist critique, which is that actually, no, this system is working as intended, and it's serving the interests of the corporate class and the war state. Like that's it serves its function perfectly.
But right. Yeah, I think of like as a modern kind of example, there's okay, so it's a little controversial to say that the Uyghurs genocide is, is not happening, or it's questionable, right?
Yeah.
But there's some very good analysis going on by people who are saying, well, the source for all of these stories, or most of these stories, is this one guy who happens to be this, business owner in this position. And it's like, okay,
yeah.
So yeah, like this is, it's meant to do something so that it feeds the empire, like you say, like, and I believe that obviously, I think there's evidence that China is committing some human rights atrocities.
Sure.
But where are we going with that is the question. Is the media aiming us towards war, or is it, is the purpose of us hearing about it as a genocide and framing it in this way, is this the purpose of this to say, hey, let's fight against China?
Yeah. And I would argue that it is, because if you look at the absolute moral hypocrisy of the mainstream media within the last few days, you've seen, so they'll sort of talk about how we need to defend the Uyghur Muslims within Xinjiang province, but at the same time, they will also like sort of do hand-wringing and moral equivocation when it comes to Palestine.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, so these Muslims count, but these Muslims don't.
Right.
And here's the reason that these Muslims count, because bringing this up is in service of U.S. empire, and these Muslims don't because it doesn't serve our interests. Right.
Yeah.
And so and again, that gets back to the core of what Parenti is writing about in Inventing Reality, which is this idea that the media exists as the stenographer of power. It exists solely to maintain the system that ultimately pays the bills, right? So,
right.
And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of share with you some quotes, a quote about sort of foreign policy and thinking about how we've sort of talked about the ways in which the sort of the field of acceptable opinion within the United States, particularly when it comes to discussions of whether it's police brutality or foreign or U.S. empire or corporate power, it's very narrow, right? So even the people who might be on the left, who are in the sort of political spectrum on mainstream news outlets, often they are sort of left liberals at best.
Right.
Maybe they'll have a DSA member, but like you're never going to get somebody who is explicitly like a Marxist or a Marxist-Leninist or like an anarchist beyond maybe say like Noam Chomsky, which again, even Chomsky himself doesn't really get mainstream interviews anymore. He just doesn't.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think a lot of it has to do with the Iraq War. I think if you look at the way in which Chomsky was treated post the Iraq War, he's clearly not getting on MSNBC, he's not getting on CNN. The only time that these people ever talk about Chomsky is every 2 to 4 years when he comes out and says, vote for the lesser of two evils, right? That's the only time they'll ever cover what he says.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
He also is, pretty outspoken on, Israel and Palestine.
Yep.
So, that's a pretty major issue. I think that's one of the things I mean, we're kind of getting off the topic of the book, but
not really. I mean, it's relevant.
Somebody once told me that I shouldn't listen to Noam Chomsky because he's a racist and an anti-Semite.
Okay.
And I was like, okay, what? But that's the line that is being fed to right-wing media and even mainstream media in a lot of ways, because you have to toe the Israel line.
Yes.
If you want to be on media.
And the main thing that I think is a huge issue within discourse regarding Israel is that there's this sort of conflating of Jewishness with Zionism, right?
Yeah.
And to me, those are two very different things. There are people who are Israelis, who maybe have been born Israelis, or who are Jewish, who are anti-Zionists, right? Then there are Gentiles who are anti-Zionists, right? Yeah. And I would kind of count myself in that book. Mainly just because, for me, again, it's not an issue of, I don't believe, and I think maybe this is controversial, I don't know. I mean, I think it is. But like, basically, I don't believe that a state should exist to serve a religion, or to serve a religious class, or a religious group. Right. And in fact, Marx even criticized this kind of thinking in an essay that's extremely controversial to people because they don't get it. They don't realize part of it is irony. The other part of it is him sort of critiquing this. He wrote an essay called On the Jewish Question, where he lays out why Jewish people should never let go of their Jewishness, but what they should do is sort of embrace secularism. Okay. And not try to separate themselves out and signal themselves out as being Jewish. And he sort of lays out why. A lot of people use this essay to sort of claim that Marx is an anti-Semite, and that's not true. But it's at the very least, it's they're blowing it out of proportion. Needless to say, I think what's very important here, because this is an extremely hot topic, is that regardless of wherever you land on the spectrum, whether you're a Zionist or not, one of the things I think we can agree on is that it's a huge problem to set up a country where you basically, the people who had lived there for forever, right, who have just as much of a sort of nationalistic claim to the land as you do, right, the Palestinians, because that whole issue started with Palestine being a sort of a part of the British Empire. And then around World War I, you had the Balfour Declaration, where the British government essentially guaranteed Israel to the Israelis, right? Right. To the Jews. And then that was never carried out, right? It was never fulfilled. And then the Holocaust happened. So like, I understand the desire for the Jewish people to have their own home. And I understand that, right? And that's the part of Zionism I understand and I can empathize with and I can agree with. My big problem is that building of your own state for your own people should not come at the expense and the subjugation and ethnic cleansing of another people. And that to me is the huge issue. Yeah. And I find it to be really distressing that a people who are ancestors of people who died in the Holocaust would then instigate some kind of policy on their own that in many ways recalls some of its worst horrors in terms of the ethnic cleansing. But that's what happens when you set up Israel, which is a settler colonial state. That's what it is, right? Yeah. And if you look at the history of Israel, it's not that different from the history of the United States. The United States is also a settler colonial state. Canada is a settler colonial state. Yep. And what did they do? They pushed out the native people. And in this case, in the United States, it was the absolute genocide and ethnic cleansing of the Native Americans. That's what we did. And we built our country on top of theirs and forced them out or killed them. And that's exactly what's happening in Israel. And this has nothing to do with them being Jewish. It has everything to do with the mindset of nationalism and settler colonialism. Yep, exactly. And to conflate that complex phenomena with you hate Jews is disgusting. And so I try very hard to be very explicit about criticism of Israel as a state, the ideology that brought it into being as a state, which is separate from Jewishness. You know, people are Jewish who are not Zionists, right? Yep. And explicit, because if we're not, then we can fall into tropes of anti-Semitism, and that's a problem. I hope that wasn't too much off base, but that's my take on it.
I think it's perfect. Part of these book reviews is it's going to create conversations, right? And I think that's one of the fundamental things is that we need to make sure we're defending people, not necessarily states, and we can critically analyze what states do without saying we should go to war and without saying that we should wipe somebody off the face of the planet. And we can walk these nuanced conversations.
Yep.
And we can do it intentionally. We don't have to just hop onto whatever the media wants us to follow in.
Yeah. And Parenti would argue a lot of that is the way in which we talk about Israel, very much like the way we talk about U.S. empire, is you have these sort of shibboleths or these sort of moral signposts that people put up that sort of narrows acceptable opinion. Right. And when we're talking about like the U.S. military complex, we're talking about our support of sort of brutal regimes or harmful regimes like Saudi Arabia or Israel. Our continued support of dictators throughout much of American history, especially the 20th century, that, well, people say, oh, well, you just hate freedom or you hate America or whatever, right? Right. And so there's like a quote that from the book that I think is really instructive of this. So Parenti says, quote, "The mainstream media began with the unexamined premise that U.S. foreign policy is above reproach, except for operational criticisms as to its efficacy. Therefore, if masses of demonstrators and rioters in other countries denounce that policy as imperialistic and oppressive, it can only be because they suffer from anti-Americanism. Anti-Americanism, that is, they have an inexplicable hatred of America and Americans. Anti-Americanism is treated as an irrational hostility towards the American people, rather than a possibly justified hostility toward the imposing and oppressive nature of U.S. policies." And I think that is right. I mean, I think that's what he's getting at there is the thing that we heard all the time during Bush 43's presidency.
They hate us because we're free.
They hate us for our freedom. They hate us for our freedom. Yeah. No, they don't. Like most people who they don't hate like Americans. Like I don't think most like people who live over there who hate U.S. empire like hate me individually as a person.
Right.
But what they hate is the system. And I think like that's important. It's important to understand that like the difference between a sort of liberal critique or a sort of even a conservative critique versus a radical or leftist critique is what I said earlier, which is that the way that sort of liberals and even mainline conservatives often look at the problems within the media is, well, it's individual actors, right? Right. And that if we can just, or it's like, oh, it's just the liberal media, like it's a huge problem. There's a whole chapter in the book devoted to how this concept of the liberal media is nonsense and how in many ways the U.S. media system is very right-wing and has been propped up by it has propped up right-wing politics for years.
It's owned by billionaires.
It's owned by billionaires. And then the public broadcasting itself is largely controlled by billionaires. I mean, people don't realize how much money the Kochs have in PBS or in NPR. Yeah. Which is like when people make the joke that NPR is just Fox News for people who like to hike, which I think is kind of funny. but anyway, so yeah, it's this narrowing of opinion or shutting out of opinions based on the dynamics of the economics of running a news business.
Right.
So say, for example, and a good example of this, and this is a generalized example from the book, is imagine that you're sort of a beat reporter and you come across a story about a company that's pouring toxic chemicals in a river and it's killing local ecosystems and it's making kids really sick because they're swimming in it and they're getting sick. And you want to write a story about this and you're kind of the local beat reporter or whatever. And you write the story and it's good and your sources are solid and you have good evidence to prove that this is going on. And you take it to your editor and the editor says, we can't run this. Yeah. And you're like, why? Why can't we run this? And it's because the company that you're criticizing has a stake in our company and we cannot be openly critical of them in public. Yeah. We can't run something too critical. Right? Which is why you'll never see the Washington Post ever criticize Amazon, really. Right. Because it's owned by Jeff Bezos, right? You're never really going to see Vox.com ever criticize Comcast because one of the single largest investors in Vox.com is Comcast. Yeah. Also Bill Gates, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And because Bill Gates actually has a substantial stake in Comcast. So that's why with Vox.com, you see all these like glowing pieces about how wonderful fucking Bill Gates is, right? Or if they are minimally critical, it's only about process, right? The process critique, which is what Parenti's getting at in that quote. Like the way that sort of mainstream liberals or mainstream centrists within sort of corporate media, when they'll talk about U.S. foreign policy, they don't often talk about like the stated goals, or they don't talk about like what the actual value of doing it is. They don't actually sort of ask the base moral questions. Okay. What they really do is talk about the process. So they'll talk about like, well, this whole process isn't working right now. We need more troops, or we need less troops, or we need to do a no-fly zone, or we don't need to do a no-fly zone. Or you'll hear this all the time. This is something the guys at Citations Needed podcast talk about all the time, is this idea of like a quagmire. We're in a quagmire in Iraq, or we're in a quagmire in Vietnam. And what Parenti makes a point of saying is that for the U.S. empire, wars like Vietnam and wars like Iraq were extremely successful. They destroyed the native government. They led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And it led to, basically the United States being able to chop up parts of the world and sell it to the highest bidder. So the defense contractors won out, the oil companies won out, and the major shareholders of the Fortune 500 made out. The only people that didn't were the native Iraqis and the American people, and the soldiers that died in the service of their empire.
Right.
So like that's what moves it, is that when you sort of talk about individual actors being bad or the process critique, when you move to an actual systemic critique and say, actually, no, the media works to serve those in power, and that it will do everything in its power to defend the U.S. empire and to defend the corporate state from any kind of criticism or any kind of real pushback.
Right.
But that's, and ultimately, like, the big thing is to get a sense of it is it's like, one of the really great short quotes, but it sort of echoes the title of the book, which is, he says, thus, corporate interests not only structure the way the media report reality, they structure much of reality itself. And I think that's super important to understand, that so much of what we live through every single day, regardless of how radical we think we are, is constantly mediated through corporate control. There's very little that you can actually think about within a given time period in your life where you're not constantly inundated by propaganda, corporate propaganda specifically, which today they call public relations or marketing. But that's,
right.
Because propaganda fell out of favor. Even though the founder of the field, a guy named Edward Bernays, who is a relative of Sigmund Freud, literally wrote a book called Propaganda in, about 100 years ago, where he lays out some of his techniques. And that would become the modern public relations business. And so when he says it controls much of reality itself, that's right, in the sense that so much of what we end up understanding is mediated through these corporate structures, regardless of whether or not we try to be independent. And media, even that we think of as being independent, often will sometimes even parrot the line of the Defense Department, because most major newspapers, whether it's the Washington Post, especially the Washington Post and the New York Times, they're essentially, when they write articles, a lot of times the inside sources are people within the DoD, the Defense Department, or the Pentagon, who have given them leaked information, or they're just basically expanded versions of Defense Department press releases.
Right, yeah.
So it's very little of it is, and they'll write, and think about that as and I guess the takeaway for this episode is, when you're reading media, when you're reading newspaper articles, if you're watching YouTube, if you're watching corporate news, think about the ways in which they talk about certain things. Look when they use passive voice. Mm-hmm. Like when they'll say, like, a headline will be like 9 died in clashes in Gaza, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's like, well, that's kind of passive. It doesn't actually say what happened, which is usually which is the case, which is that IDF forces killed 9 people. But they're not going to say that, right? Because that doesn't look good. And so, that's the thing you have to think about. And so, because it structures much of reality itself, you have to constantly fight back.
The funny thing, like, there's also a book I have, it's called Seeing Red, and it goes through the history of Indigenous peoples or Native peoples in Canadian media, and the way that they frame the Indigenous peoples, and the way that has impacted the public view of those people. And it's the same thing, right? It's the same thing that we used to hear about how they would discuss the color of a black man who was wanted by the police, where they wouldn't discuss the color of a white guy or whatever. They would frame things in certain ways, and these are all, and even the choice of what stories to cover and which stories not to cover, it all paints a picture of a media that is controlling how people think. And I mean, when you say it that way, it sounds conspiratorial, but it's literally the way that things work.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned that, because there's actually a chunk of the book where Parenti makes that exact point, which is that when you often bring this up and you talk about this way with some people, they will often call you a conspiracy theorist. And then he brings up the correct point of saying that, like, that some conspiracies are true, right? Like, that the CIA actually did run drugs in Central and South America, like that really happened. The fact that the United States government actually did perform horrific syphilis experiments on African Americans without their knowledge. Like, there are real conspiracies. And arguments against conspiracy theorists would be a lot easier if governments would stop doing shady shit. Yes, absolutely. Right. And the thing is this, and this is the point that Parenti gets home. And this is something I agree with too, which is that, why are conspiracy theories so powerful? Why do they profligate? One, sometimes it's because they are true. They are objectively true, whether it's COINTELPRO or MK Ultra or other shit, right?
Yeah.
But the other part of it is, what is the thing about conspiracy theories that is valuable? Even the most outlandish ones. It's people are thinking systemically, which is how people on the left think.
Yeah.
The way that liberals and conservatives often think about the world is it's just a bunch of random individuals fighting against one another for their own self-interest, and everything's kind of chaotic. And you'll hear phrases like, well, it's complicated or it's complex and this kind of shit. Reality, sometimes it actually isn't that complex if you understand systems analysis. And I think us on the left, whether you're an anarchist or a Marxist, you understand things systemically. And when you explain things to people systemically, you often get painted as a conspiracy theorist.
It sounds conspiratorial.
It does sound conspiratorial, but it's not, because, it's as Parenti would say, it's rational means that are pursuing irrational ends that ultimately are irrational ends, right? Like, for those in power, pursuing, another conflict in the Middle East is rational to them, because they genuinely believe that, I think some of these people do genuinely believe that the United States is like a beacon of hope for the world, and that we are this light of democracy, and we can, like, people genuinely believe that, right? Yeah. And so I don't think everyone's completely cynical. I do think people have some genuine beliefs, and those are acted upon, but they're acted upon within systems, and the systems themselves reinforce what ideology can become. Yeah. And so, I think that's what's important. So, like, I'm not condoning people, like, believe in, like, the earth being flat and shit. It's not my point.
Right.
My point is that with conspiracy, unless it's completely outlandish like that, when it comes to government, it's really important to actually look at the evidence and see what it is. And because a lot of times the United States has done horrible things and in the name of U.S. interests, which is their sort of PC way of saying empire. Right. And so don't discount the systemic way of thinking, because that's the separation between sort of normies and people like us. We don't see things as just random individuals hacking it out in the ether. With no rhyme or reason. We do see the systemic things around us.
Yeah, like I even was thinking the other day, like even an individual person's situation, you cannot analyze it without analyzing the systems surrounding that person.
Yep.
You have to examine everything that is going on that causes them to be in poverty or addicted to drugs or committing crimes. You have to actually look at all of this stuff. You can't just say, oh, well, that person's a criminal or a drug addict, right?
Yeah. And that doesn't negate individual responsibility or the role of the individual within society. I'm reading a classic essay right now by Russian Marxist Georgy Plekhanov, which is called The Role of the Individual in History. And he talks about sort of situating how individual actors work within history from a Marxist perspective. And it goes back to Marx's great, sort of paraphrase of Hegel, where from the 18th Brumaire, where Marx says, men make history, but not in the conditions of their choosing. And I think that's right. I think that we all do have some level of agency within our lives, but that agency is, again, much like the media, is mediated through institutions. And it's important for us to understand that, like, we are a part of systems that are much larger and much more powerful than we are. And so, I know it's like cliche to say, but sometimes, like, when you look at the world like this, it's kind of like you've been pulled out of the Matrix and you kind of see shit
a little bit.
It really is, right?
If only they hadn't ruined the term red pill.
Yeah, red pill. I was trying to say all of that without saying red pill, even though the Matrix trilogy is a trans allegory, which is, but it's like, but yeah, I mean, I think that's true. Or I think an even better example, well, not an even better example, but a great example, and one of my all-time favorite movies is John Carpenter's They Live. From 1988 with Roddy Piper, right?
Yeah.
And he finds the special glasses, and without them, he sees the world as the systems want him to. But when he puts the glasses on, he sees the world for what it is, which is, it says like breed, consume, buy, and then he finds out that like half the population are like, weird looking aliens, right? And and of course, anybody who's ever watched like Zizek's Pervert's Guide to Ideology, they know that like what he's talking about is ideology, right? And the goal is not so much like to just take the glasses off and just see the world as it is, because no one can. That's impossible. But the goal is to get you a better set of glasses. Yeah. And so, you take off your sort of normie shit liberal glasses, and then you put on, ooh, I got my Kropotkin glasses, or ooh, I got my Marx glasses on, or in my case, I got my Parente glasses on, and you start seeing the world a little bit differently, because we're all going to be mediated by ideology. That's just the name of the game. The question is, which ideology do you believe in? Is it one in service of power, or is it in service of the people? And so, like, it to me, that's kind of the view of it, and why, Michael Parenti's Inventing Reality is a classic book. And I think anybody who's interested in critiques of the media, anybody who's read Manufacturing Consent should read this book, because I think they're great companion pieces. And it's a classic book, 5 out of 5 on the Goodreads. And
Nice.
It's a classic book, indispensable. Should be on everybody's bookshelf, although it's really hard to find a physical copy. So get you an ebook online.
So 5 out of 5 for Michael Parenti.
5 out of 5. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a classic book. And then I think next time, if I finish it, I don't remember exactly what I have on the schedule for next time. Let's see what I have. Ooh, yes. Next time, we will be talking about the book, The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton.
Oh, nice.
Which is all about modern monetary theory, which I think we've talked about before.
I'm looking forward to that.
And so we're going to be talking about the book and about how deficits really don't matter, and the whole sort of deficit trolling complex, and her experience working in government. That's a great book. So, and then some future books kind of down the line. If you're interested in this new segment, I'll be covering Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific by Friedrich Engels. And then one that I'm finishing up right now that I'm really excited about doing at some point is The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which I just read for the first time. Cool. And then another book we'll probably be doing in a few weeks is this book called Americana, which is a history of American capitalism. Oh, nice. So we've got a whole bunch of stuff in the queue, and if you're interested in more of what I do, you can check me out on Instagram at Justin Clark PH for public history, and you can check out my website, justinclark.org.
Cool. Well, thank you for this review.
Yeah, this was a lively one. This was a fun one. It was a good back and forth. Yeah, which was good for me, because I was always worried. I'm like, will I have enough prepared? So, but yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, and I look forward to next time.
You bet. That's all, folks. Thanks for listening. Remember to share this show with your friends and on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects when I'm not at work so that I don't have to work as many hours at gig jobs. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can send me money on PayPal at paypal.me/brainstormpodcast. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on your podcast app of choice or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out my link tree at linktr.ee/skepticalcory. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other shows, which include Skeptarchy, which is a panel show I do with some very smart people, and From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics. My Twitter is @SkepticalLefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, or you can send me a friend request at facebook.com/CJBrainstorm. I accept most friend requests. You can also email me at themindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening or watching, and remember, the truth leans left.